Okay. Seems to want to be doing it. So, check 1, 2, just making sure it's recording. Okay, and so let's go back to the slides. Oh, I deleted the slides. Okay. And we were slide 39. Okay. Okay, good. All right, so it seems to be working now. So thank you for your guidance there. Okay, so let's go ahead and remember we were determining, or we had determined that the upper deviation rate was 8.2%, and that 8.2% said was coming from the table. So table one, the first table we looked at showed us the sample size, didn't it? What table 2 here is going to do is show us now the results of our sampling. In other words, it's going to calculate our upper deviation rate. Okay. Now, it would be important that you would evaluate your sample on the correct table. So if you pulled your sample from a 95% confidence level, you would have to evaluate your sample on a 95% confidence level evaluation table, right? So I could give you on the test the table to pull your sample size, or I could tell you pull your sample size from the 95% table. Now evaluate your sample to calculate your upper deviation rate, and I'll give you 2 tables, a 90% table and a 95% table. You got to evaluate the sample on the 95% table, right? Okay. So you come down, and we found 2 deviations. We find our sample size, which, thanks a lot, table. I wouldn't do this to you on the exam, because our sample size was 78, wasn't it? So this is kind of an idiotic example, because we should have been able to go to the table that had the same sample size. Okay, so we would have gone to the 78, or if we didn't have a 78, we'd go to 80. We wouldn't go to 75 like they're doing, because that's a smaller sample size, right? So we go to, well, no, I guess we would go to 75 if you don't have 78, because you would get a more conservative outcome. Okay, so I guess if they didn't have 78, you would go to 75, a smaller sample size, to get a more conservative outcome. And that's where they got the 8.2%. That's where they got the 8.2%. Okay, so you read the results, and what happens? The results told us it was 2.6%, didn't it? Okay, but the table is telling us what? It could be as high as 8.2%. Okay, and again, if, like we saw in the previous slide, my tolerable deviation rate was 6%, then no, I'm not going to rely on that control. I'm going to believe that my control does not have the correct operating effectiveness. I'm probably going to increase my substantive testing. I'm going to alter the nature, extent, and timing of my substantive testing nature. I'm going to now use external evidence instead of internal extent, larger sample sizes, timing, do year-end testing instead of interim, right? If my tolerable deviation rate had been, say, 9%, then yes, I can rely on that sample. And so what am I going to do? I'm going to be able to do internal evidence instead of external evidence, extend smaller sample size for my substantive testing. I'll be able to do some interim testing, right? Okay. Question on that? Okay, now, there's something called allowance for sampling risk. Okay? And the allowance for sampling risk, think of it as a cushion, cushioning you against the what? Potential that there could be undetected deviations in that sample, right? Okay, the undetected deviations in the population, I should say, based on your sample, right? So we give ourselves a cushion. Again, we don't care about the minus side of the cushion. We only care about what? The plus side of that precision. We put a cushion on the top side of that. So the allowance for sampling risk is calculated as the difference between what the sample told us the deviation rate was and what this table is telling us what could be the upper end of that deviation. In this case, the way you calculate it in all cases is you take the upper deviation rate minus the sample deviation rate, and that difference is the allowance for sampling risk. In this case, it would be 5.6%, or 5 point. Is that 5.6? 8.2 minus 2.6. Is that 5.6? How does that not sound right? 8.2 minus 2.6, is that 5.6? Why does that sound right? Okay. Okay. Question? Okay, good. So you can see, guys, that what? Not that hard of stuff. I mean, you hear audit sampling, you see sampling, you think, oh my God, I'm going to have to calculate a frequency ogive or something stupid that you had to do in your statistics class. Meanwhile, it's all about the terminology, isn't it? Okay? Okay, good. So if the tolerable deviation rate is less than the upper deviation rate, then what? I should say if the upper deviation rate is more than the tolerable rate, you do not rely on the control. As we saw in what I wrote in the previous slide, if your tolerable deviation rate is more than the upper deviation rate, say 9%, then you can rely on that control. Okay. Okay, good. Non-statistical sampling. It is okay to use non-statistical sampling. Okay, and they give us an idea of the different sample sizes to support the different assessed levels of control risk. Notice, guys, that what? The desired level of control reliance, if you're going to rely highly on the control, that means a lower assessed level of control risk, bigger sample sizes. Right? If you're not going to rely as much, that means a higher assessment of control risk, and the sample sizes work inversely. So even in non-statistical sampling, the concepts stay the same, don't they? Okay, I mean, the main takeaway is you do not have to use statistical sampling. Use random sampling. Use random sampling. Okay, so in addition to evaluating the frequency of deviation and tested controls, an auditor should also consider certain qualitative aspects of the deviations. The auditor most likely would give broader consideration to the implication of the deviation if it was the only deviation. No, if it's the only one, I'm feeling pretty good, right? Okay. Identical to deviation discovered during the prior year's audit. No, because I already have an expectation of what goes on with that client. Okay, they got this problem. I just audit around that problem, don't I? Or I design my audit around that problem. Okay. Caused by an employee's oversight. Okay, well, it happens. That's why I'm testing the controls, right? If it was initially concealed by a forged document, hang on a minute. Now we're into the fraud aspects, aren't we? And remember, if we start to see what? Remember, when we look at fraud, guys, we look at it in the planning stage to see how potential fraud will impact my inherent risk, my control risk, and then I have to design my detection risk accordingly, don't I? And so let's say when I'm planning the audit, I look and I see the fraud. I don't see any of the fraud risk factors. I say, okay, risk of material mistake due to fraud is fairly low. But then I go ahead and I find a forged document. Well, now I have to go back and what? Replan. Wait a minute. I'm not even worried about fraud risk factors anymore. I found fraud, didn't I? So now I'm driving up my inherent risk. I'm driving up my control risk accordingly, and I'm going to have to respond by lowering my detection risk pretty substantially, right? And I'm going to maybe call in my what do you call that? Personal flag my ACE, thank you, my ACE fraud auditor to come in and start looking at these kinds of things, etc., right? Okay? Okay, good. All right. Let's take a look at an auditor plans to examine a sample of 20 checks for counter signatures as prescribed by the entity's internal control procedures. Counter means two, at least two signatures, one by the CFO and one by the CEO or something for checks over a certain dollar amount, one of the checks in the chosen sample 20 cannot be found. The auditor should consider the reason for this limitation and what? Treat the missing check as a deviation. Look, if you are testing a certain control to see if it has operating effectiveness and you can't find the document, you know, they're going to say, hey, Charlie, where's check number 473? Oh, I don't know. Look, it didn't have the counter signature plan. Sorry, you got to see it to believe it, right? Auditors are from Missouri, is a show me state. Okay, we're not to the inquiry stage anymore. We're to the what? We're to the performance inspection stage, aren't we? I think at this point we have to see it. Okay? Treat it as a deviation. Just assume it wasn't signed. Which of the following statements is correct concerning statistical sample in compliance testing? Okay, guys, consider compliance testing a synonymous term for control testing, right? Did they comply with the prescribed controls, essentially? Okay, so we take a look, and the population size has little or no effect on determining sample sizes. No effect on determining sample sizes except for very small populations. Isn't that what we said on the slide? For large populations, the what? Population does not affect sample size. Okay. The expected population deviation rate has little or no. Yes, it does. The expected deviation rate did affect sample size, didn't it? It was expected deviation rate. It was what? It was confidence level or risk of assessing control risk too low, and it was the tolerable deviation rate were the three factors on that one slide that were affecting sample size, wasn't it? Tolerable deviation rate had what? Direct or inverse relationship? Had what? Had an inverse relationship. Good. The confidence level, the risk of assessing control risk too low had a direct or inverse? Inverse. Good. The lower the risk, the bigger the sample size. Poison apples. Remember that, right? Okay. And expected had what? Had a direct relationship, right? Okay. So population, which is is correct. Expected deviation has little. Yes, it does. As the population size doubles, the sample size also will double. Again, population has very little impact on the sample size, right? Okay. For a given tolerable deviation rate, a large sample size should be selected as the expected population deviation rate decreases. Look, guys, you know, sometimes they're writing answers that sound like an auditor that just took his sixth shot at tequila. I don't know what to tell you. You know, I'd be like, oh, my auditor buddy said that. I said, okay, you're going to be home. You're going to be okay. Did you fall down and smack your head? Did something go wrong? You know, your spouse tell you they don't love you anymore? I mean, why are you talking like that? Something's not right. Okay, I don't know what to tell you other than something's wrong with this person. Okay. All right, number 46. That's how I was talking. I went to a conference for the National Association of Black Accountants in Las Vegas last week, and I put $300 down on the A's. I only bet when it's an even money bet, and I only bet on my team, the A's, because I'm going to watch the game anyway. I know that, and it takes you 4 hours to lose your money. An even money bet means you put down 300, you can win 300. So if I'm there and the A's are being called even money against them, it's another put money. Okay, so it happens. The game is 1-1 the whole game before I get to the score beginning. And so I'm watching my phone, and then all of a sudden Tampa scores 3 runs in the top of the ninth. It's 4-1, the A's are going to lose. So okay, I'm going to go to the sports book anyway. I'm going to have a gin and tonic there and find my gin and tonic, right? So what do the A's do? The A's score 4 runs in the bottom of the ninth and win the game, and I win my $300. So after that happened, after sitting there for a while, I was saying stuff like, You know, for a tolerable deviation rate, a larger sample size should be selected as expected population deviation rate decrease. Okay, sir, move along now, okay, because that makes absolutely no sense. Okay, so all of that story was true except the last part. Okay, all right, including the part where they told me to move along. All right, now what happens? In determining sample size for a test of controls, an auditor should consider the expected deviation rate, desired confidence level, and what? Tolerable deviation rate. Again, the three factors that affect sample size. Okay. Okay, good. Number 47. As the control is deemed to be more important than thought at the time that attribute sampling parameters were set, the auditor most likely would respond by what? Decreasing the tolerable deviation rate, right? You want a bigger sample size. That control is more important than you originally thought. If the control is important, if you're saying, hey, this whole system fails if this one control isn't applied, then you're going to really audit the heck out of it. You take a much bigger sample size, you're going to lower your tolerable deviation rate, right? Okay? All right, good. It's not chapter 8, it's module E and F. Question? Okay, good. So here's what we're going to do. Because I'm not a big fan of starting slides and not being able to finish them in a particular set of slides, we're going to go and look at the homework and the quiz. And when we get to questions towards the back of the homework and the quiz file, because I put them all together in one homework and one quiz assignment for E, F, and G, the last few questions of each of those deal with the last chapter. We won't deal with those, but we'll deal with the upfront ones. And then next time we'll deal with module G and the back end questions of the homework and quiz assignment for E, F, and G. Okay, so let's just go ahead and let's get into that. I guess I can close this. And McGraw-Hill, zoom tight. Don't get sick. Too late? No, I don't mean it that way. I just don't want you to be sick. You can't get me sick. Well, I've got a cure for you for a bad immune system. It'll take you about 7 years working in a hospital, manning the garbage chutes. So you pull the lever on the garbage chutes, and here comes all the hospital garbage down. And you got to take all the bags and throw them away. Immune system like a rock. They can't expose me to anything that I haven't already been exposed to. Okay. Yeah, you sit there and think, well, that's horrible, John. Why did you do that? I don't know. That was just the job I got, and I stuck with it that whole time. But I sure was motivated. Pass the CPA exam. Get the hell out of there.
Well, I understand. I worked faster than the lot when I was young. You want to remember. After that, I was like, I need to go to college.
Right? They call that being scared straight. Yeah. My dad got me a job in the factory between my junior and senior years. Now I know why he did that, you know. It's like, oh, no. I'll go to college, I promise. Okay. Okay, good. It still was a housekeeper in a hospital, though, for a while there. Preview. Retrieving questions, please wait. Really? Come on now. That doesn't seem right. That shouldn't be taken that long. Are you guys able to see the question? Why is it giving me a hard time there? Okay, let me see. Let me close this. Summer 2019. EF and G homework. 3 students in progress. Very good. Preview. There we go. Okay, good. Okay, so let's take a look at these. In an audit sampling application, an auditor performs procedures on less than 100%. Is that what sampling is? Looking at less than 100%. Okay. Auditors consider statistical sampling to be characterized by the following: representative sample selection and non-mathematical evaluation? No, we want it to be representative, and it is what? Mathematical evaluation. It allows us to quantitate. We can say we are 99% certain that the account balance is not misstated, can't we? Based on the results? The risk that decisions made based on samples will differ from the decision made if we had looked at the entire population. That was our sampling risk, wasn't it? Which of the following is not a method the auditor uses to control their exposure to sampling risk during the examination? Ensuring that all items have an equal opportunity. That's random. We do use random sampling, don't we? Okay. Performing the appropriate audit procedure. The audit procedure is a procedure that you choose to do what? To help you with the assertion, isn't it? Okay, so the procedure that you choose, if you choose the wrong procedure, that would be a non-sampling risk, wouldn't it? I'm trying to determine the existence, and I go from the supporting documents back to the financial statements. That's not going to help me with existence. That helps me with completeness, right? So I don't care how big the sample size is. I don't care, how big the sample size is. Let me repeat that. It doesn't matter if I'm going the wrong direction for the assertion, right? Okay? Determine, and you'd be surprised how often that mistake is made. And that people will suggest an audit procedure, and I'll be like, years out of the GL, and that would prove, and then when people that think it through, that proves nothing, or the opposite. So when you're doing an audit procedure, you've got to ask yourself, what am I trying to accomplish with this audit procedure? And if you can't answer that question, you need to take another look at that procedure to make sure that you know why you're doing that procedure, right? Okay. Okay, good. Determine an appropriate sample size. No, that is something that we will use to limit our exposure to sampling risk, right? Larger sample size, less risk, right? Smaller sample size, more risk. Okay. Evaluate sample results using a mathematical basis. That's what we're doing with our sampling, and we can sit there and move our numbers around accordingly to increase or decrease our sampling risk, right? Which of the following major stages of an audit is most likely related to attribute sampling? How about control testing? These other are what? Substantive testing, in which we're going to use what? Variables or dollar unit sampling. Number 6, which of the following factors has a direct relationship on sample size? How about tolerable? Tolerable is what? Inverse, isn't it? How about expected? Expected had direct. So that's a what? No, yes? Option B. Number 7, which of the following would not result in the audit team selecting larger samples, a larger sample controls for examination, a reduction in the risk of over-reliance? Remember, guys, over-reliance is the risk of assessing control risk too low, isn't it? Okay, so if I reduce my risk of assessing control risk too low from 10 to 5%, then all the numbers on that 5% table are bigger, aren't they? So that's not the answer. An increase in the tolerable deviation rate from 3 to 6, that was on my sample size table when I went from whatever it was in our example, we were at, I forget what we were at 6 and we went to 7 or something like that. Our sample size got smaller, didn't it? From 78 to 66 or something stupid like that. So if you want to reduce your sample size, you reduce your sample size if you increase your tolerable deviation rate, inverse relationship. I think these last couple ones deal with, dollar unit sampling, monetary unit sampling. So we'll deal with those. We'll deal with the last 3 questions next time. Okay. So with the time we've got left, let's jump into the quiz then. Any questions? Right here. Okay. Non-sampling risk can occur in which of the following type of sampling plans? Statistical sampling and non-statistical sampling, because sampling risk deals with sampling. And non-sampling risks don't deal with sampling. Non-sampling risks were things like what? Selecting the wrong audit procedure, being fooled by some sort of fraud scheme or something, etc., right? Auditor error. Sampling deals with sampling, whether it's statistical or non-statistical. The probability that an auditor's conclusion based on a sample might be different from the conclusion based on the entire population is sampling risk. Which of the following types of sampling applications can appropriately be used under generally accepted auditing standards? Both statistical and non-statistical sampling are perfectly acceptable, right? Which of the following components of the audit risk model is most closely associated with attribute sampling? Control risk, we use attribute sampling to help what? Help us to determine the control as operating effectiveness. And we are using that to support a lower assessed level of control risk. If we assess the risk, if we assess control risk at maximum, how many items are we sampling for our control testing? If we assess control risk at the maximum, how many items are we sampling for our control testing? 0. We're not doing our control testing, right? Okay, so it's all about that assessment of control risk that's governing that sample size, right? It's governing that tolerable deviation rate. Confidence level really is not so much associated with our assessment of control risk as it is the auditor's risk appetite. If an auditor is saying, hey, I don't want to make the wrong decision, I don't want to eat poison apples, no sample size was good enough, right? Okay, it's how adverse you are to that risk is really where your confidence level comes in. If you're an auditor that's going to ride around in a red Ferrari all the time and you're not going to worry about it and you want to get home early all the time, then what? Just increase your Decrease, I should just say, your confidence level and live dangerously, right? Now that sound you hear is the cop pulling you over. Okay? As part of the assessment of control risk, the auditor decided to use audit sampling. After specifying the audit objective, what would the auditor most likely do next? Now, first off, what is the audit objective? Give an opinion on the financial statements, but when we're sitting there and we're making an assessment of control risk, what is our objective? Was control designed and implemented in a manner to prevent or detect a material misstatement in the assertion, right? So remember, guys, we select controls that go along with the assertion. For example, when our client opens an account for a new customer, they're supposed to check their credit rating first. That's a control, isn't it? So we would look at a sample of sales orders where they open up an account and see if there was the credit check, right? What assertion? If I'm looking at a control, then there should have been a related assertion that I was thinking that that control is preventing or detecting the misstatement in that assertion, right? So if I'm looking at sales orders to see that there's some indication that there was appropriate credit approval, what assertion? So let me get this straight. Who said existence? Okay, Michael, existence. So you're saying that if they check the credit worthiness of somebody they're going to open an account for, that means that the person really owes them the money? Huh? Valuation, right, is going to be the assertion, isn't it? Because what? If they check the credit worthiness first, then they're only issuing credit to people that, what? History shows they pay their bills, right? And so what's going to happen? I have that control, so there really shouldn't be that many people who can't pay their bill. So what happens? I don't have to do as much testing around the valuation assertion, so maybe what I'm doing is I'm just doing some analytical procedures over the allowance to see if it makes sense compared this year to that year, the amount of receivables versus the amount that's in the allowance. I'm what? I'm using a less effective procedure. I have to increase my detection risk. In that sense that you're having is, well, wait a minute, you just increased your detection risk. Yeah, I can do that because what? My risk of material misstatement is down. If my risk of material misstatement is down, my detection risk can go up. I use a less effective procedure. I can use an analytical procedure as opposed to having to send out all these confirmations externally, large sample sizes, etc., right? Okay, so when you're sitting there and you're looking at the control, you're looking at how that control lines up with the assertion, right? If that control lines up with the assertion well, and you sit there and you get some evidence that the control has been well designed, credit check, implemented, we go ahead and we see for one day that when they're going to open up a credit account, we're there and we see that they do the credit check, whatever, and then what? And then we pull a sample of sales orders and we look to see that they've been signed off on. We're getting what? Support of operating effectiveness of that control with evaluation assertion, right? So we should what? Determine, the next step would be to do what then? Define deviation conditions. Okay, the deviation would be what? No, what would be the deviation, going to sticking with our example, Michael, what would be the deviation in a situation where we were looking for a credit check, credit report for a new account? What would be the deviation from that? They don't do it. They're supposed to stamp credit approved. And we pull a sales order and we say, excuse me, why doesn't this one say credit approved? Charlie, didn't you approve the credit for that one? Yeah, I did. No, you didn't, because it doesn't say. What if the sales order is missing? Then they didn't do the control, right? Okay, so that would be a deviation. Then you do what? Then you would go ahead and you would determine the sample size, okay? Then you would do what? Then you would select the sample and then you would perform the procedures, okay? Sample to test control procedures are intended to provide a basis for an auditor to conclude whether operating effectiveness. Isn't that what we're looking for when we sample? We evaluate the design, we implement, we look at the implementation, then we look for operating effectiveness, right? As a result of test controls, the auditor assessed control risk too low and decreased substandard procedures. This assessment occurred because the true deviation rate in the population was, I'm going to put something up on the board for this. Okay, let's do a quick little art project. What is this? Well, I would agree with you, but most dice have 6. Oh, excuse me, not 5. I guess in some places they have 5, though. But they don't have the little dots coming out of the dice, unless you're in Vegas and the eggs 1 and you're rolling the dice and you're seeing lines flying off. Not a dice. This is a barrel of apples. Okay, now, what happens? You sit here and this, what is this A on the hat? No, because it doesn't have apostrophe S. Although some of the old A's hats have just an A on them, which could mean anything. Could mean we're the asses, right? But no, that A means auditor. So here comes the auditor, and the auditor does what? The auditor tests 4 of the apples, and it comes back no poison. The auditor does what? The auditor eats the 5th apple and dies. And hat falls off, drops the apple, the whole works. Auditor eats the 5th apple and dies. This happened because what? The true deviation rate in the population was more than the deviation rate in the sample. The sample deviation rate was what? 0 divided by 4, or 0%. That was the sample deviation rate. The true population, the true was what? 1 out of 5 or 20%? You see why I didn't want you to eat that 1 apple? To reach back in and grab an apple? Okay? And so what happens? The true deviation rate in the population was more than the deviation rate in the sample, wasn't it? Right? Now, is eating an apple a wrong decision? Is eating a poison apple a wrong decision? Yes, it is. It is what? Assessing control risk too low a wrong decision. Yes, it is. And you made that wrong decision because what? This mistake occurred because the true deviation rate in the population was more than the deviation rate in the sample. Question? Okay, that's a tough question. That's a CPA exam level. Well, actually, all of these are. I don't really pick a question if I don't think it could potentially be CPA exam. Okay? think those last three questions are from the module. Oh, module G. Okay. All right, guys. So we'll go ahead and we'll go. That's actually pretty good timing. So we'll get out now. I'll post the recordings for these. Looks like we've solved the problem with the recordings not working for us. And I will see you next week. We'll finish up module G in the next chapter.
I was just thinking, hopefully you didn't delete the